wanted to say thank you, Todd and the Twin Cities Sangha, for inviting me to speak to you today for the Eshinni Kakushinni Memorial Service. And I really appreciate the chance to be able to share my own appreciation for these two wonderful women in our tradition. All right. Hold on a second. Let's see if this works. All right. Hopefully everyone can see the PowerPoint. Yes? Okay. All right, so I'd like to share about Eshinni and Kakushinni's ultimate reliance on the teachings, because one of the traditions I grew up with hearing about Eshinni and Kakushinni is, of course, focused on Eshinni and how, because of her letters, we have evidence that Shinran actually existed, because prior to their rediscovery in 1921, Shinran had become pretty much a myth. And because Shinran himself never left any diaries or any physical evidence that he truly existed. And yet these letters that were rediscovered in 1921 helped ground the idea that no, Shinran actually really did live. He actually had a wife. And that was the remarkable thing. He had a wife and family. But one of the things that we often gloss over in hearing about their history is the truly difficult times that Shinran and his wife and family lived through. And again, like Todd was saying, causes and conditions allowed for me to be here today instead of being in Japan. Causes and conditions have also brought about a situation that we're in that actually isn't too far off from some of what Eshinni and Kakushinni and Shinran all experienced in their own lifetime. So I'd like to start off with a reading from one of Eshinni's letters. So this is from letter 10, which was written about 1268. So it's her last letter, and they believe that she died shortly after this. So if you would please join me in Gasho. Indeed, how I wish I could be there. Indeed, how I wish there could be one more time for me to see you and for you to see me while I am now in this world. I myself will be going to the Pure Land Paradise very soon. There, everything can be seen without any darkness. So be sure to say the Nembutsu and come to the paradise to be with me. Indeed, when we go to the paradise and meet again, nothing whatsoever will be in darkness. Namo Amida Butsu, 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 Namo Amida Butsu. So as I mentioned before, this was written towards the end of Eshinni's life. She was about 87 or so. And over the last few years, she had been writing to her daughter, mentioning of the end is coming soon for me, I think. The end is coming soon for me, I think. And now we really see that she really is thinking that this may be the last chance she has to write to her daughter. And her daughter, though, is several hundred miles away in Kyoto. And they've been separated for almost 10 years because their youngest daughter, Kakushinni, had stayed behind in Kyoto to help care for her ailing father. But Eshinni had to return to her family homeland in Echigo, which is present-day Niigata Prefecture. So it's on the northern Sea of Japan side, kind of northwest of Tokyo. And she's living there apart, and it kind of feels like how we are now, socially distanced, right? She wants to see her grandkids and her daughter, but she can't because she knows it's too dangerous for her to travel to see them. And it's even too dangerous for her younger family to come visit her. But she finds solace in that there's the chance that they will meet again in the Pure Land. And she's assured of this. And you can see this sense of assuredness in the way that she reminds her daughter, be sure to say the Nembutsu, and we'll be able to meet each other again. So again, Eshinni was born around 1182 and lived until about 1268, although there's maybe some evidence that might be pointing to she actually lived a few years even beyond that. But as Todd mentioned, she was born to a well-off family in the Echigo region of present-day Niigata. We're not sure exactly what rank her family was, but there's estimation that she wasn't really truly nobility because she ended up having to essentially manage her own land. So they weren't well off enough to essentially pay for hired labor to manage the lands for themselves, but well enough off that they did have land and that they did employ many workers on their lands. As a young adult, we learned that Eshinni actually took refuge in the Nembutsu through Honen's teaching, Master Honen, who is the teacher of Shinran Shonin. And so even before meeting Shinran Shonin, she had already been exposed to the Nembutsu teachings. And it was when she was around 28 or so that she eventually married Shinran Shonin. And the two would end up having 6 children together, including Kakushinni, their youngest daughter. And so we can already just see from these things that, wait a second, she was 28 when she got married? Even for those times, that was considered really old, and so a bit surprising. And even though we don't have details of what actually happened, we can kind of make some educated guesses about her own life. That, obviously there were some difficulties and maybe even a previous marriage and a husband who had passed away before she met Shinran. But eventually she does meet Shinran, and she finds a companion who's also walking the path of the Nembutsu teachings. And so together they end up having a family. And I think one of the things we can take away is just how much the Nembutsu really supported Eshinni in her life with this exiled monk who is defrocked and sent to live in the Netherlands of this upper northwest side of Japan. The winters, if you've ever been to Niigata, can be very harsh. Lots of snow, not unlike what I've heard of Minnesota. Whereas I come from Southern California where we don't get snow, so I don't have that experience. But I can just imagine seeing these snow-covered lands, and yes, there's snow in Kyoto where Shinran grew up, but it doesn't get to be quite so bad because Kyoto itself is actually in a fairly protected valley. So Eshinni ends up spending roughly 30 to 40 years with Shinran. They spent a few years living in Echigo, and then eventually the family moves to the northern Kanto region. And they take this long, treacherous hike that spanned over probably many months to get from the west side of Japan to the east side of Japan, just north of Tokyo, in what is now present-day Ibaraki Prefecture. And when they settled there, they ended up living in this region for about 20 years, where Shinran shared the Nembutsu teachings with all who would listen. And it wasn't easy because Eshinni had to give up what she was used to. She apparently had a fairly comfortable life living with her family on their family farm. They had, food that was constantly coming in. She knew that land because she had grown up there most of her life. And now they're suddenly in a different land, different climate, different everything, probably even a slightly different dialect of the language. And so she's having to deal with all these adjustments, aside from raising 6 children. And yet somehow she finds something to ground her, because we all know we've been through, difficult changes, maybe even changes that we didn't want to do, but kind of forced into doing. And yet when we get thrown off by something like that, if we don't have something that grounds us, we can easily be thrown off so emotionally. So our mental states start falling apart because we don't know how to deal with those changes. And yet there's something in Eshinni that keeps her steady and is able to help continue to support her family and her husband through these many difficult years. Eventually, the family moves about 20 years later to Kyoto. And there they spend another 10 to 20 years before Eshinni is called back home to Echigo, presumably to take over her family's lands after the passing of her parents. And it doesn't seem like she had other siblings to rely on. And so instead, it fell to her to return home and take care of the land. And so begins the physically distant years of Eshinni and her husband Shinran, and also from her daughter Kakushinni. So around 1253, Eshinni returns to her hometown in Echigo to help care for her family there, including some orphan grandchildren. And it's through her letters that we find out that there's been several different epidemics that have happened, several different flus or fever-based diseases that have ravaged the area. And so one of her older daughters has passed away, leaving a child, as well as the wife of one of her sons. And so again, she ends up having to take in her orphan grandchildren to support them and care for them. Kakushinni, however, stays in Kyoto with their father to look after him, as Shinran was in his 80s by then. And Kakushinni also had a family of her own. She had a son and a husband who ends up passing away during this time. So one of the things in reflecting on Eshinni and Kakushinni's life, we start to realize the more things change, the more they really do stay the same. You know, this is almost 800 years different from where we are today in 2020. And yet some of the same things, same patterns we can see happening again, right? We get job calls that, you know, maybe we have to pack up and leave, or you have adult children who are off at college and then they get a job offer that's maybe all the way on the other side of the country, or maybe in a completely different country. And so you have that separation. And 2020, with the way it's been, pandemic, you know, all this strife and divisiveness because of politics, the different injustices that are coming to light, you know, because the pandemic has made these differences more apparent, we realize maybe things aren't so different. And so there maybe are lessons that we can learn from the past. So again, Eshinni faced many challenges that aren't so different from today. And I think for me, that's one of the things that helps me get through these difficult times, is to realize I'm not the only one going through this. Not just temporally, I realize, you know, all of us, this whole world is experiencing this pandemic, but also we're not the only time period that has experienced these kind of difficulties as well. It's happened repeatedly throughout history. And so not, you know, as we read from Lady Kujo's letters, you know, it's easier then to sympathize and empathize with others who have suffered like we are suffering. Or even if we're not suffering, that we can still find space to empathize with others in suffering. So I just wanted to share a little bit more about Eshinni from her own letters. She lived through, again, epidemics, even male trouble, starvation, isolation, and old age. In one of her other letters, this is from letter number 3, she states, "Since everyone's situation is alike, and since the whole society has suffered, there is no place we can turn for help. I don't know anything about cultivating the land and don't know what to do. This world seems increasingly undependable. Though it's not clear how much longer I will live, there is no reason for me to feel better towards the world." And I just want to sit with this passage for a little bit. She's talking about suffering because of starvation. There's a great famine that's been going on in the Echigo region. She talks about how it's not just her farm, but also the farm of her sons and other relatives in the area, other friends in the area's farms. They've all their crops have failed. And so their whole society, as she mentions, is suffering. So they can't even turn to each other for support and help through these difficult times in terms of surviving for food. They can't rely on the local government because the government relies on the local farms to help support others. You know, at that time, you would raise so much rice and then you would give a part of that rice to the government as a tax. And then from there, then the government could redistribute as necessary. But because all the crops had been failing, even the government didn't have its backup supply of rice to share with others. Sounding kind of familiar with the maybe not so much rice these days, but the toilet paper issue, right? It's all gone. What do we do from now? But even in terms of food, we see that in the really long lines of food banks all over this nation, that everyone is suffering in such great ways. And even though we thought that this country had more than enough to give, we're clearly seeing where it can't and where it hasn't been able to help those that need it the most. And yet through all of this trouble, she's having mail troubles. She keeps writing in her letters that, I'm not sure you got my last letter, so I'm writing again. Or if you did get my letter and you wrote back to me, I haven't been able to receive it. There's this uncertainty that she can't even depend on the mail system. Again, sound familiar? And again, she's also going through, old age and isolation. And yet through all of these difficulties, she still finds space in her letter to write to her daughter. There is no reason for me to feel bitter towards the world. So how does one not become bitter? We hear these stories of suffering. We even experience it ourselves. And I know for me, it's really hard not to be bitter about some of the situations we find ourselves in. As Todd mentioned, I was supposed to go to Japan to study abroad. 2 days before I was supposed to leave for the exchange program at Ryukoku University, I was asked politely to not come because that was the beginning of the outbreak. This was in March of this year. When you hear that news and you've been planning, not just a simple move, but a move across country to a whole nother country, and all of a sudden your life's turned upside down, how do you not become bitter about what's happened? For me, I'm fortunate. I dug into the Jodo Shinshu teachings and found solace there. But for others who maybe don't have that sense of grounding, we can see it unfortunately in so many others who are losing hope, who are becoming bitter about what's happened to them in this world, in the difficult changes that we've all experienced. So for me, the way to not become bitter is through Na Mo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Our Nembutsu. Right? For me, when I say Namo Amida Butsu, it's not the please me to make this better for me, fix what's going wrong, give me what I want. It's the thank you for reminding me that there's something more to this world. There's more to this life than just wallowing in my own self-pity, right? And so in reading Eshinni's letter, I see that despite everything that's going on around her, she realizes that piece of it's not just me that's going through this. She does recognize it's happening to everyone around her. And so in some ways that helps her have compassion for other people because it's not just her. But it's also, this is just one aspect of my life. There's also something more important. And what's more important is I have my settled birth. That relieves a whole lot of stress, right? Our biggest fear in this life is what comes next. And that what comes next isn't talking about what happens tomorrow. I know I'm going to get up tomorrow and what's going to happen to me, during my day tomorrow. It's the big, what happens next? What happens after this life? But in the Jodo Shinshu teachings, we're taught that when we have deep in trusting, when we are completely reliant on the teachings, our birth in the Pure Land is assured. And so that relieves that stress, right? That anxiety that we all carry in us about death. When you're not having to worry about what happens to you when you die, it kind of puts your world in perspective. And so for me, Eshinni's letters, again, it provides that instance of here's a woman who is suffering so much and sees so much suffering around her. And yet she's able to move through it because she entrusts in the Dharma. And this brings us back to her original statements in telling her own daughter, don't despair about me dying soon. Just make sure you say the Nembutsu so we can be together in the Pure Land, because there in the Pure Land, darkness is dispelled. The light of Amida Buddha's wisdom and compassion dispels that darkness. Whether it's literal darkness, whether it's, mental state darkness, it dispels all of that. And one other type of darkness that we sometimes don't consider is also doubt. It dispels the darkness of doubt. And, we all go through this. Even if we think that we have really good entrustment in the Dharma teachings, we'll hit a bump or something that maybe makes us question, wait, what happened? Why is this happening? Why do I feel this way? Is this stuff even really true? But again, the Nembutsu teachings help dispel that doubt, because when we realize that the primal vow is specifically for each and every one of us, that includes me, as messed up as I am with all of my flaws, my discriminatory thinking, all the attachments to I mean myself, that even someone like me is carried through the light and compassion of Amida Buddha, then I know that there is truth to the teachings, right? And I think Eshinni also realizes that there's darkness in her daughter, and so she's great at pastoral care. So I know I've mostly talked about Eshinni, but I want to share this story of Kakushinni and her mother, and how Eshinni's strong faith and strong reliance in the teachings helps dispel the doubt of her own daughter. You would think that Kakushinni, since she's been raised by her father since she was born in the Nembutsu teachings, that, how can this child who's been raised in these teachings ever have doubt about whether the teachings are true and real? And yet, Kakushinni does doubt. So she, again, cared for her father and was by his side when he died. And you would think that, again, you've seen your father, you saw how he died, and apparently Shinran died very peacefully reciting the Nembutsu. And yet, his own daughter doubted whether he was really born in the Pure Land when he died. She apparently had asked, how could that be? Because where were the purple clouds and celestial signs? So during this time period, it was often common to have stories of, or death records of Pure Land believers who, when they died, purple clouds arose, or there were other celestial signs like rain falling with no clouds, or flowers just instantly blowing through the air. That there were these kind of mystical signs that would tell people that, oh yes, Amida Buddha came for the person who died and took them to the Pure Land. And apparently Kakushinni didn't see any of these signs. And so she wrote to her mother going, I didn't see any of the signs. Father must not have been born in the Pure Land. And you can sense Eshinni's own concern for her daughter's despair at not seeing these signs. And so Eshinni writes a letter to her daughter, assuring her that, no, there aren't signs like that, but it's everything else in your father's life that spoke to the fact that he really did end up being born in the Pure Land. And in this way, she tells her daughter, it's, partly her own vision that Todd talked about, of seeing this vision that Shinran Shonin was also a manifestation of Kannon Bodhisattva. But just how he lived his life with the Nembutsu teachings, that he shared the Nembutsu teachings with everyone else, that this was his primary focus and concern in life, was that people to share the teachings to benefit others, that those were the signs that of someone who lived a life that was truly entrusting in the teachings. And so because of that, Eshinni herself had no doubt. She didn't need the purple clouds. She didn't need celestial signs to affirm for her that Shinran had been born in the Pure Land. Instead, she took the more tangible signs of his own personal faith, his own personal entrusting in the teachings. And so we see this end up bringing about a change in Kakushinni herself. From that moment on, she ends up saving away for something for her father to memorialize him. Because at first, when her father died, she actually didn't have plans, apparently, for the mausoleum that ended up being made in his honor. But apparently from this letter from her mother, reaffirming for her that you have these doubts, but when you truly entrust in the Nembutsu, even the doubts of your birth and others' birth go away. That she finally saw the truth for her in the teachings. That she was looking for all the wrong signs in her life. And now that her own faith was reaffirmed, Kakushinni set about to build an appropriate memorial for her father. And she realized that because there were so many people that were calling to ask about her father. There were people who were sending support, whether it was money or rice or other means, from faraway lands in Japan to her father, that there were all these people who were deeply touched by the teachings her father shared. And so that helped her develop her faith and entrustment, that if these weren't true, all these people would have left my father and forgotten him the next day if the teachings meant nothing. And so, again, it's just interesting how all of these things come about in Shinran's life, in Eshinni's life, in Kakushinni's life. And I wonder, again, how different is it from our own? Do we go through these points of, do we doubt our own birth, or do we doubt the birth of others that we know in the Sangha? Are we looking for those signs of perfection, even though we are Bonbu people, right? We're still sometimes expecting perfection out of people, even ourselves, but more often others. But is that what the teachings are really teaching us about? Or are they teaching us that there's something more, something deeper? So I just want to close that Eshinni and Kakushinni have done for all of us, that there's no way to encapsulate that all in one Dharma talk. But I think especially in light of today's very real suffering that we're experiencing through the epidemic, through shelter in place or other physical distancing, that we're not alone, that not only are others in this immediate time frame suffering along with us, and we can do something to shift our mindset from that suffering, or maybe not so much that we are doing it, but that the Dharma is helping shift something in us and bring that little bit of light that grows and pushes away the darkness that keeps creeping in. The darkness that says, this suffering is never going to end. The suffering that is too much to bear. The suffering that it doesn't make any sense, right? So if it doesn't make any sense, then nothing can be true and real. But there's something in the Dharma, I think, in the teachings, in saying Namo Amida Butsu, in relying completely on Amida Buddha and the teachings, that can bring light and hope and compassion and comfort to us all. And when we're grounded in that, then we can move forward, and that we can share in both the sorrow and the joys of all people. You know, we had that piece from Lady Kujo that talked about we can easily empathize with others in suffering, but in joy we have difficulty. And I think we see that also now in today's times, right? I'm suffering, and so if someone else has a piece of good news, you get grouchy and you don't want to hear it because it just reminds you of how much you're suffering, and it's not fair, right? That little kid comes up inside us that says, that's not fair that they're happy and I'm not. But again, when we go back to the teachings, we can find some compassion and realize their happiness is a good thing, even if I can't experience it for myself, right? There's something about happiness that can spread, and rather than being jealous about it, being envious about it. And so again, I just want to finish with a rereading of the first passage from Eshinni's letter and reminding us again about how the Dharma can help us through the darkness. And even if we don't get another chance to meet each other in person, there's always meeting in the Pure Land. So if you would join me in Gasho. Indeed, how I wish there could be one more time for me to see you and for you to see me while I am now in this world. I myself will be going to the Pure Land Paradise very soon. There, everything can be seen without darkness. So be sure to say the Nembutsu and come to the paradise to be with me. Indeed, when we go to the paradise and meet again, nothing whatsoever will be in darkness. Namo Amida Butsu. 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 So again, thank you, Twin Cities Sangha, for allowing me this time to speak with you and share my thoughts on Eshinni and Kakushinni.